You know what your problem is, Clarke? You think 20 months at community college makes you a real nurse. That is what Dr. Sterling said 14 minutes before everything changed. Valley Memorial Hospital, Portland. Night shift. The fluorescent lights hum overhead with the steady drone of something dying slowly, and the ICU smells like antiseptic layered over floor wax and something else underneath, copper, maybe, or just the ghost of it. The linoleum stretches out in pale tiles that catch the overhead glow and throw it back at nobody in particular. It is 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the hospital breathes differently at night. Slower. Meaner. The daytime nurses have gone home to families and dinner tables, and what remains is skeleton crew and the people who chose to work in darkness. Hannah Clarke moves through the unit with economy of motion. One foot in front of the other. No wasted steps. No excess conversation. Her scrubs are pressed sharp enough to cut, and her hair is pulled back so tight it looks like punishment. She is checking the 4 line in room 314 when the charge nurse calls for admissions. New cardiac patient coming in. Routine monitoring, the nurse says. Nothing complicated. Hannah nods once and continues her work. She adjusts the flow rate on the infusion pump, a 0.5 milliliters per hour drip, steady and precise, and the patient, an elderly woman with papery skin, reaches out and touches her wrist. "You're good at this," the woman says. Hannah doesn't smile. She doesn't explain. She just says, "Rest now," and moves to the next room. But her hand lingers on the pump for 1 second longer than necessary. Pain is information. Kindness is strategy. Both can be silent. Room for 47 is at the end of the hallway. The admit paperwork is already in the chart. Colonel Victor Hendricks. Retired. 72 years old. Cardiac history, admitted for monitoring post-stress test. Hannah reads the name and her hand freezes on the clipboard. 2 seconds. That is all. Then she straightens the papers and she walks into the room. He is asleep. Still in hospital gown. For line already placed by triage. The cardiac monitor traces his rhythm across the screen, sinus rhythm, clean, normal. She has seen thousands of these patterns in 18 months. She could read his heartbeat in her sleep. She stands in the doorway for a moment, watching the line dance, and then she steps inside and does her job. She checks the foresight. Saline lock, no swelling, no signs of infiltration. She notes the time in the chart. She verifies the monitor leads are secure against his chest. Everything is protocol. Everything is procedure. Nothing is personal. He wakes as she is adjusting the blood pressure cuff. "Where am I?" His voice is rough from sleep. Valley Memorial ICU. Portland. Her voice is barely above a whisper. "You're here for observation. Everything is normal." He looks at her face and something shifts in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. But then his eyes close again and she finishes her work and leaves without waiting for more questions. The charge nurse catches her at the station. "Looks like evening rounds will be interesting tonight." Hannah says nothing. Dr. Sterling arrives at 12:15 a.m. wearing arrogance like cologne. He is tall in the way men are when they have never been hit hard enough to understand posture, and his white coat is monogrammed with his initials in thread so fine it looks printed. The medical degree hanging in his office is from a school in Dominica that he mentions in exactly every third conversation. He walks through the unit the way he walks through life, as if the space rearranges itself to accommodate him. He reads the admit for room 447 and he smiles. When Hannah enters the room to prepare the patient for evening rounds, Dr. Sterling is already there with the patient's daughter, a woman in her 50s wearing anxiety like a second skin. The patient is sitting up now. Awake. Alert. His monitor shows the same clean rhythm it has shown all evening. "Commander Clarke," Sterling says. He uses her first name wrong, stretching it into something that sounds like an insult. He is holding the chart. Why don't you walk us through the admission assessment? Hannah stands at the foot of the bed. Her hands are at her sides. She is being watched by 3 sets of eyes. Vitals stable, she says. Heart rate 62, blood pressure 138/81. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. For access patent. Monitor shows normal sinus rhythm. 18 months. Sterling says this to the daughter, not to Hannah. That is how long our nursing staff here goes through in terms of formal education. 19 months. Community college programs. He turns to Hannah. Walk us through the cardiac assessment protocol. The real protocol. The one taught in actual nursing schools. Hannah's jaw tightens. A single muscle. No tremor. No color change. She meets his eyes and holds them for exactly 3 seconds, and then she turns back to the patient. Heart rate is regular, she says quietly. No murmurs on auscultation. Peripheral pulses are strong and equal. Capillary refill under 2 seconds. No signs of heart failure. No edema. No JVD. The daughter is watching this exchange. The patient is watching it. Sterling sets the chart down on the bedside table with the kind of precision that suggests violence. You know what your problem is, Clarke? You think 20 months at community college makes you a real nurse. He steps toward her. Close enough that she can smell his aftershave, something expensive and cloying. You come into these units with your associate degree and you think you can assess cardiac patients who have been under the care of actual physicians for decades. You think bedside manner covers a lack of training. Hannah does not step back. She does not apologize. She does not look away. She looks at him for 2 more seconds, and then she looks at the patient. Your father's wound from the stress test is clean, she says to the daughter. She gestures to the small bandage on the patient's groin where the catheter was inserted. The bleeding has stopped. Pain is controlled. He is comfortable. The wound, Sterling says, is being assessed by someone without proper training in cardiac intervention protocols. Hannah reaches out and carefully checks the dressing. The site is dry. Intact. The color underneath the bandage is normal. She has checked this 6 times since admission. She will check it 6 more times before dawn. The wound is clean and your father is comfortable, Hannah says quietly. That is what matters. 1 tear escapes from the corner of her left eye. Just one. She wipes it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the daughter, without acknowledging Sterling's presence at all, and then she finishes her assessment and leaves the room. The daughter says, "Thank you," but Sterling is already moving to the next room and Hannah is already halfway down the hallway. The break room smells like burnt coffee and something that died in the refrigerator 3 weeks ago. Hannah sits at the small table with her sandwich, turkey and mustard on wheat, the same thing every shift, and opens it. The charge nurse walks in. Then the night nursing assistant. Then the respiratory therapist. All 3 of them see Hannah sitting there and something in the room changes. They exchange glances. Brief. Practiced. And then they turn around and leave. She eats alone. By the time she finishes her shift, the unit board has a new entry. A formal write-up. Laminated. Pink paper. The kind that gets into your permanent file, the kind that administrators cite when they want to build a case for something bigger. The note is signed by Dr. Sterling. Excessive time spent at bedside with patients. Failure to maintain appropriate clinical boundaries. Possible unauthorized patient counseling outside the scope of practice. Observed spending 8+ minutes per patient visit when standard protocol allows for minutes. Recommend review of nursing assessment procedures and implementation of stricter time management protocols. Hannah stands reading it. The hallway is empty except for the day shift nurses filtering in early. They look at her. They look at the board. They look away. Someone whispers something and it dies quickly. She has been marked. Not officially fired. Not yet. But mark the way an animal is marked in a herd when the others sense something wrong. She reaches out and touches the laminated paper. Her hand is steady. Her breathing is steady. The trembling in her chest is not fear. It is something older. Something that learned very young how to stay quiet and survive. She takes the paper off the board and folds it in half and slides it into her scrub pocket. Room for 47 is dark when she passes it one final time. The colonel is asleep. Monitor still normal. Vitals stable. She does not go inside. She does not need to. His heartbeat is the same steady rhythm it was at midnight, and she will be back tomorrow night, and the night after that, checking his vital signs and watching his monitors and keeping him alive while he sleeps, and he will never know that she knows him. That she knew him once. That the man in the bed court-martialed her in Tikrit for a classified operation she cannot discuss, cannot remember in any way that doesn't involve blood and screaming, and that now she saves his life every single shift and smiles at no one about it. But that wasn't the worst part. The man in room 447 arrived on a Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. via ambulance from St. Vincent's downtown, post-operative from a lower GI bleed, stable vitals, recovering from emergency colonoscopy and clipping. Hannah was assigned his care during the night shift, standard protocol, routine admission, the kind of patient who'd be discharged in 48 hours with discharge paperwork and dietary instructions. She didn't know until she pulled his chart that his name was Colonel Victor Hendricks. The name hit her like a fist. She stood at the nurse's station holding the tablet, staring at the admission details, her fingers steady on the screen but her lungs suddenly tight. Victor Hendricks. Not a common name. Not a name that belonged to a random post-op patient in Portland, Oregon, 2,000 miles from the dust and screaming of Tikrit where she'd been a commander and he'd been the officer who signed the court-martial papers. The papers that buried her. The papers that made her invisible. She set the tablet down. Breathed through her nose. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone, and she made herself count the rhythm, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, the same 4 count that had kept her alive in a field hospital while mortars painted the walls. Her hand steadied. Her face settled into the professional mask she'd perfected. By the time she entered room 447, she was just a nurse with an associate degree from Portland Community College, and Colonel Hendricks was just another patient. He was smaller than she remembered. The uniform had made him bigger, the rank, the bearing, the absolute authority that came from knowing you could end someone's career with a signature. Without it, he was just a man in his 60s with post-operative pallor and an 4-line running into the crook of his arm, sedated enough from pain medication that his eyes weren't quite tracking the television mounted on the wall. He didn't recognize her. That was the mercy of it. "Good evening, Colonel," Hannah said, pulling on latex gloves with a snap. "I'm your nurse for tonight. We're going to monitor your vitals every 2 hours, keep the 4 fluids going at 75 milliliters per hour, and I'll manage your pain medication as needed. Your incision is healing well. You'll likely be discharged tomorrow afternoon pending the surgeon's final rounds." He nodded vaguely, the morphine doing its work. "Good. Wife's worried. Your wife can visit during morning hours. For now, rest is what you need." Hannah checked his cardiac monitor, sinus rhythm, normal rate, the reassuring beep 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 of a heart doing what it was supposed to do. She adjusted his blanket, made sure the call button was within reach. Professional. Competent. Invisible. Press this if you need anything. She was 3 hours into her shift when Dr. Sterling appeared at the nurse's station and asked to speak with her privately. The phrase itself was a threat. Nobody asked to speak privately about good things. They stood in an empty hallway outside the break room, and Sterling smiled like a wolf recognizing wounded prey. "I noticed you're assigned to Colonel Hendricks. That's quite a patient. He's recovering well. Vital stable, pain managed. Impressive, given your background." Sterling's eyes were bright, predatory. "Tell me, how does someone with your educational limitations understand a case this complex? Post-operative GI bleed, cardiac considerations, the kind of patient who really requires a nurse with rigorous training. Hannah felt the air pressure drop. This was different from the humiliation in the patient room, different from the silent isolation in the break room. This was Sterling calculating something. I follow the surgeon's orders. Monitor, report, manage comfort care. Of course you do. Sterling moved closer, his voice dropping. You know, that patient, Colonel Hendricks, he's military, isn't he? Leadership background. The kind of person who'd understand standards. Expectations. Credentials. He paused, watching her face. Would be interesting if he knew he was being cared for by someone without a bachelor's degree. Someone with a very questionable background, by the way. I've been doing some digging into your personnel file, and there are some fascinating gaps. Years missing from your history. Classified employment, it says. Curious, that. Hannah's jaw tightened once, a single clench, then released. She said nothing. I'll be monitoring his care very closely, Sterling continued. Very closely indeed. Anything that seems even slightly outside protocol, I'll know about it. Clear. She nodded once. Walk back to room 447. Checked Hendricks' cardiac monitor. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The man was sleeping, his breathing easy, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen when he was awake and signing papers that unmade her. The next morning, Hannah's daughter Mia called the hospital around 8 a.m., during the tail end of the night shift. Hannah took the call at the nurse's station, her voice dropping into the gentle register she kept for home. Hi, baby. What's wrong? Mommy, I need you for show and tell. Mrs. Patterson said we have to bring something about what our parents do for work, and I don't have anything. Mia's voice was small, uncertain. 9 years old and already understanding that her mother was somehow different from the other parents. Can you bring pictures? Other kids' parents have pictures. Hannah looked down at her scrubs, the name tag, the stethoscope draped around her neck. That's not how mommy's work works, sweetheart. My job is helping people feel better. That's what everyone's parents say. But Mrs. Patterson said we need proof. Like, what do they do exactly? Mia paused. Were you always a nurse, Mom? Did you do something else before? The question hung in the fluorescent-lit hallway where 3 nurses were charting, where Dr. Sterling was checking orders, where the hospital system had no record of Commander Hannah Clarke and all the years that came before. She felt the weight of it, the classified operations, the field hospital, the 17 missions, the bodies she'd held together with her hands and will and trauma shears. All of it buried. All of it erased. All of it unable to fit on a show-and-tell form. I've always helped people, honey. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. But what did you help them with? Was it, like, nursing? Hannah closed her eyes. We can talk about it when I get home. Tell Mrs. Patterson that Mommy's job isn't the kind that photographs well. After she hung up, Sterling was watching her from across the nurse's station. He didn't look away when she caught him. He just smiled. The shift report came in at 6:45 a.m., and Sterling made his moves with the precision of someone who'd been planning them for days. He called the charge nurse over and announced, loud enough for Hannah to hear, that Jenna and Marcus, both of whom had worked regularly with her, were being reassigned to different floors for professional development opportunities and cross-unit training. The charge nurse didn't argue. Sterling had allies. Sterling had the institutional power to make people disappear from a schedule without explanation. Then he altered the electronic scheduler, Hannah noticed when she checked it during her remaining breaks. Her next 3 shifts were paired with Jennifer, who'd been a nurse for 8 months and had heard Sterling's whispers about an investigation. Jennifer was polite but distant, checking her phone between patient rounds, clearly uncertain whether being near Hannah was safe. That same afternoon, Sterling submitted a request through the electronic system restricting Hannah's access to patient files. Quality assurance review, it said. She could pull charts, but only through him, and only with his approval. It meant asking him permission to do her job. It meant every question became a conversation with someone who wanted her destroyed. By the time night shift came around that Wednesday, Hannah had been systematically separated from her allies, paired with someone too new to trust her instincts, and locked out of the tools she needed to care for patients effectively. This was stage 4 of Sterling's campaign, the strategic destruction. Not loudly. Not with his fists. With policies and schedules and institutional leverage applied with surgical precision. She worked around it anyway. Colonel Hendrick's cardiac monitor showed something at 2:14 a.m., a pattern shift, subtle enough that most nurses would miss it, irregular intervals that could indicate his heart was starting to tire. The clipping had been successful, the bleeding controlled, but something in his rhythm was off-key. She'd seen this before. In Tikrit, when a patient who looked stable was actually beginning to fail, the body whispered before it screamed. She requested a full chart review through Sterling, who approved it with visible reluctance. She read every note, every medication, every intervention. She studied the preoperative baseline cardiac rhythm, the postoperative readings, the progression. The pattern was there if you knew how to read trauma. A heart working too hard, compensating, starting to fail. Hannah flagged it to Sterling during morning rounds. Colonel Hendrick's cardiac pattern is changing. The rhythm is becoming irregular. I think we should consider a 12-lead EKG and possibly cardiology consult. Sterling glanced at the monitor, glanced at Hendrick's sleeping face, dismissed her with a wave. Colonel Hendricks is stable. His vitals are fine. Your concern is noted, but I think we can trust the surgeon's assessment over a nursing hunch. Focus on tasks within your scope, Clarke. Cardiac interpretation is complex. Maybe too complex for community college curriculum. Hannah opened her mouth. Closed it. She'd already lost her colleagues, her access, her credibility. Pushing harder would only give him more ammunition. She nodded once and moved to the next patient, but she made a note in her personal log that night, a habit from Tikrit she never broke, documenting everything the hospital system wouldn't. During her evening rounds at 11:47 p.m., Hannah checked the crash cart parked outside Hendrick's room. Standard protocol. The chest tube kit, essential equipment, sterile, ready for emergency decompression if something went catastrophically wrong, was missing from its slot. She flagged it to the charge nurse immediately. The chest tube kit needs restocking outside 447. The charge nurse nodded, made a note. I'll have it done tonight. It wasn't restocked. Hannah checked the cart again at 1 a.m. The slot remained empty. She checked again at 3 a.m. Still missing. She made another note in her personal log, location, time, equipment status, the fact that she'd reported it and it had gone unaddressed, because in Tikrit, documentation saved lives when the system itself was compromised. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Colonel Hendrick's cardiac monitor was showing more irregular intervals now, and the equipment designed to save him if his heart failed was sitting somewhere in a storeroom while Hannah watched her options disappear one by one, stripped away strategically, leaving her standing in a room with a deteriorating patient and nothing but her hands and her training and a man who'd already destroyed her once. The monitor alarm for room 447 changed at 2:47 a.m. Hannah heard it from the nurse's station where she was charting the evening vitals for a post-op patient, a sound she'd trained herself to recognize in her sleep, the difference between a standard arrhythmia alert and something that meant minutes, not hours. The pitch shifted. Higher. Faster. A rapid desaturation warning that sent her body upright before her mind finished processing it. She was moving. The hallway between the nurse's station and room 447 was 43 feet. She counted them without thinking, the same way she'd counted distance in field hospitals in Tikrit where every second was calculated in blood loss and neurological damage and the precise moment before shock became irreversible. Room 447 was dark except for the monitor glow. Colonel Hendricks was sitting upright, gasping, his shoulders heaving, his lips taking on the dusky purple-gray of profound hypoxia. His trachea was deviated to the left, she could see it from the doorway, the shift in the line of his neck unmistakable. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsed. Air was compressing his heart. She hit the code button without breaking stride. The crash cart was outside the room, and she wheeled it in with one hand while reaching for the oxygen mask with the other, her movements precise and economical, nothing wasted. Colonel Hendricks' eyes were wide, panicked, searching her face for answers she wasn't sure she was allowed to give. She placed the mask, adjusted the flow to 15 liters per minute, and opened the crash cart drawers in sequence, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory from a different life, a different uniform, a different identity entirely. The chest tube kit was gone. She knew immediately. The kit should have been in the third drawer, the sterile packaging in its assigned slot, the documentation logged on the cart checklist. The space was empty. She opened the second drawer. Nothing. The fourth. Empty. Someone had cleared it, Sterling, maybe, following his pattern of strategic removal, taking tools away before the moment they became essential. The calculation was almost impressive in its cruelty. Almost. Dr. Sterling arrived as she was assessing the cart, his white coat still buttoned despite the 2:47 a.m. hour, his hair perfectly combed, his presence announcing itself like an instrument of bureaucracy and protocol. He glanced at Hendricks, registered the distress, and reached for his phone with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own authority. "We need a chest tube kit from OR, stat page them," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to problems solving themselves through his command. "Get the resident on the phone, tell them code blue, room 447, tension pneumothorax, ETA to bedside." Hannah's voice cut through his words like a blade through silk. "Quiet. Absolute." The voice of someone who had held lives together with her bare hands while mortars fell and there was no backup and no higher authority to call. "He has 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. OR is 6 minutes away." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Then we bag him and manage his airway, Clarke. We don't improvise with equipment we're not authorized to use. That's how people die." But Hannah was already moving, her body responding to something deeper than protocol, something that had been trained into her through 18 months of combat trauma and 2 tours where the difference between innovation and death was measured in seconds. She left the room, her badge clacking against her ribs as she moved, the sound sharp and metallic in the fluorescent-lit hallway. The locker was in the break room, the one marked with her name and nothing else, because she'd learned long ago not to personalize spaces that weren't hers to keep. She opened it. Her spare scrubs. A half-empty water bottle. And the vacuum-sealed MRE package she'd kept without thinking about why, the same way some people kept photographs or jewelry, some piece of the world she'd left behind but couldn't quite discard. She tore the package open with her teeth, the edge of the plastic between her molars, and pulled the inner packaging free. Her fingers worked automatically, practiced, creating what soldiers called an improvised occlusive seal from the flexible plastic and the corner valve, a flutter mechanism that would allow air to escape but not enter, the oldest field medicine in the world refined down to its simplest components. The hiss of air escaping. Back in room 447, Sterling was still on his phone, his voice raised now, demanding the surgical resident, when Hannah returned. She placed the improvised chest seal over the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers finding the landmarks by touch, muscle memory and Tikrit, and every moment she'd promised herself she'd never have to do this again. The seal adhered. She looked at Hendricks, this man who had court-martialed her, who had signed papers that officially erased her, and she spoke with the calm of someone who'd already survived the worst the world had to offer. "Colonel, this will hurt but you'll breathe." She located the needle from the crash cart, 14-gauge catheter, the same gauge she'd used on field casualties under mortar fire, and found the intercostal space with her eyes closed, trusting the geometry of the human body, the spaces between ribs that were always exactly where they were supposed to be. The needle went in. The sensation of penetrating the pleura, that subtle pop like breaking through a membrane of water, and then the sound that saved lives. The hiss of escaping air. 90 seconds. Start to finish. Hendricks gasped, his color pinking immediately, the cyanosis retreating from his lips like sunrise coming back to his face. His respiratory rate dropped from desperate to labored. his oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor, 68, 74, 82, 88, pushing toward normal. His eyes met Hannah's for exactly 1 second, and she saw something there that looked like recognition, like the moment when a soldier realizes they've just been saved by the enemy they thought they'd destroyed. The code team arrived 3 minutes later to find him breathing, stable, conscious, with an improvised chest seal that shouldn't have worked but had, that defied everything about protocol and authorization and the careful boundaries of what nurses were allowed to do. Sterling's face went white first, then red, the blood rising in his neck like shame or rage or the collision of both. His hands clenched. His jaw worked without words, because there were no words in the protocol that explained what he'd just witnessed. 2 nurses had been in the hallway when Hannah moved, Bethany and Raj, both relatively new staff, both still building their understanding of hospital hierarchy and whose opinions mattered. Sterling's eyes locked on them with calculation, not rage. Calculation was worse. Rage was honest. He pocketed his phone. The surgical team from OR arrived to find Hendricks already stabilizing, his chest seal holding, his vital signs returning to a range that suggested he might actually survive the next 6 hours. The senior surgeon examined the improvised seal, tested its integrity, and looked at Hannah with an expression somewhere between astonishment and respect. "This is field medicine," he said, the words carrying a weight that filled the room. "This is what they train you to do in combat zones when equipment fails." Sterling was already moving, already calculating. He spoke to Bethany as she passed in the hallway, his voice low and concerned and poisoned with implication. "Extraordinary incident. Glad she has all those years in the field to fall back on, but the board's probably going to want to document everything. Formal investigation. Witness statements. You understand, just procedure." Bethany's expression shifted. She glanced back at Hannah, who was still in the room, checking Hendricks' pulse with her fingers, ensuring the seal was holding, her face showing nothing, absorbing the blow with the composure of someone who'd learned long ago that reactions were luxuries. Sterling moved to Raj next. "The medical board's going to need to interview anyone present." "Not a problem, just protocol. But you know how these things go, they ask a lot of questions about judgment calls, about authorization. You were here, so they'll need you to explain what you saw, step by step. It's going to be detailed. It's going to be thorough." By the time Hannah finished checking Colonel Hendricks and documenting the emergency procedure with precision and honesty, writing down the missing chest tube kit, the improvised seal, the needle decompression, the exact timeline, recording everything that would hang her with the board, she already knew that Bethany and Raj would be gone by the next shift, reassigned, separated, isolated, removed from the proximity of her influence before they could form opinions or loyalties that didn't serve. Sterling's narrative. The calculation was masterful in its cruelty. The only person who could have said they witnessed her saving a life was already being strategically removed from the equation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as Hannah walked back to the nurse's station at 3:16 a.m., her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her composure intact, she could already hear the phone calls being made, the strategic conversations beginning, the machinery of institutional power shifting to ensure that by morning, no one would remember that she'd saved Colonel Hendricks' life at all. They would only remember that she'd broken protocol. Dr. Sterling's hands moved with mechanical precision as he sat alone in his office at 3:47 a.m., the hospital corridor outside humming its quiet nocturnal frequency. He didn't pace. He didn't rage. He calculated. The phone was already in his hand, his Rolex catching the desk lamp as he dialed the Chief of Staff's emergency line. "Dr. Pemberton." "Yes, I know it's late." Sterling's voice carried the practiced tone of a man who saw crisis as opportunity. "The nurse in trauma, Hannah Clarke, just performed an unauthorized procedure using non-sterile food packaging during a critical airway emergency. I have witnesses. The liability exposure alone." He let the silence hang. "No physician supervision. Complete protocol violation. I'm not saying the patient didn't survive. I'm saying we're exposed." Pemberton's groggy voice crackled back. Sterling hung up and immediately dialed 2 more numbers. "Medical board allies. See the narrative. A pattern of independent action. Unauthorized decision-making. The kind of language that made hospital administrators twitch. By 4:15 a.m., Sterling had composed 3 emails. The first went to the scheduling department under the subject line, "Immediate Staffing Rebalance." Bethany Morrison and Rajesh Patel are needed on the pediatric ICU effective immediately due to sudden acuity surge. Please make the transfer from night shift effective tonight. This is a critical staffing need. No one questioned it. The email bore Sterling's credentials, the weight of his MD. By 5:30 a.m., when Bethany and Raj arrived for their shift change, they were intercepted in the parking lot by a unit manager with printed schedules and apologetic explanations about unexpected patient volumes in PQ. Both of them protested. Both of them were overruled by a system that didn't recognize the setup, the strategy, the erasure happening in real time. Sterling then rewrote the master schedule for the next 3 shifts, Tuesday night, Wednesday day, Wednesday night. Every nurse who'd worked with Hannah, who trusted her, who would have vouched for what happened in room 447, was suddenly reassigned or scheduled off. He moved Diane Chen to medical surgical floors. He gave Marcus Washington the week off, family emergency coverage, completely legitimate. He shuffled Keisha Washington to the geriatric unit. The schedule was now a weapon, and by the time anyone noticed the pattern, it would be too late. At 5:47 a.m., Sterling made one final call to the IT department. "I need to restrict one user's access to patient files in the electronic medical record system, effective immediately. Patient safety concern." "Yes, that's for me to determine." The male voice on the other end didn't push back. Sterling gave Hannah's employee ID. By 6:15 a.m., her login credentials were flagged in the system. Any attempt to access patient records would log her as a security violation. The room was a stage perfectly arranged for theater. The hospital conference room at 7:30 a.m. was filled with day shift staff, nurses, techs, respiratory therapists, a resident still holding a cooling cup of coffee, and they all looked confused about the early gathering. Dr. Sterling stood at the head of the table with his tablet in hand, his posture projecting absolute confidence. Dr. Pemberton arrived 3 minutes late, settling into a chair with the uncomfortable air of a man who'd been briefed but not fully convinced. Hannah was called in. She appeared in the doorway still wearing her night shift scrubs, the pale blue fabric bearing the same small wrinkles it had worn through her entire shift. The chest tube incident had ended at 3:16 a.m. It was now 7:32 a.m. She had not slept. Her eyes carried the flat clarity that came from 16 hours of consciousness and the particular exhaustion of having saved a life while the machinery of institutional power began its move against her. "Thank you all for coming." Sterling's voice was butter smooth. "We need to address a serious matter. Effective immediately, Hannah Clarke is terminated for grossly violating hospital protocol by using unapproved materials in a critical care situation. Specifically, employing non-sterile food packaging in a medical procedure." He paused, letting his gaze move across the room. "This represents a direct threat to patient safety and hospital integrity." The room went dead silent. That silence was the sound of people understanding what was happening, not the words, but the power structure they were witnessing. Hannah stood near the door, motionless. Her face held no expression. Her hands were steady at her sides. Dr. Pemberton shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He looked at Hannah directly. "Ms. Clarke, do you have any relevant medical training beyond your nursing degree? Military experience, perhaps, that might contextualize this improvisation." Hannah opened her mouth. She saw herself in dress uniform. She saw Colonel Hendrick's face in Tikrit after she'd held Trauma Unit 7 for 15 hours straight without a break. She saw the classified folder stamped with red letters. She heard the voice of her commanding officer from 3 years ago, "You disappear. You don't exist anymore. Commander Clarke is erased. You surface, you talk about any of this, there are consequences beyond your comprehension." She closed her mouth. "No relevant experience to share," Hannah said quietly. The words landed like stones. Pemberton nodded, uncomfortable, and reached for his coffee cup. Then I'm afraid Dr. Sterling's recommendation stands. Please surrender your badge. Hannah reached up and unclipped the badge from her scrub pocket. She set it on the conference table. The plastic hit the laminate with a soft click. No one moved. No one spoke. She walked out. The drive home stretched across the city like a sentence with no ending. Sunrise broke over Portland in shades of gold and pink, the kind of morning that should have meant something good. Hannah's hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, her knuckles white against the worn leather. She was still in her scrubs. Changing clothes in the locker room would have required her to stop moving, to acknowledge what had just happened, and she wasn't ready for that yet. The house was quiet when she arrived at 8:14 a.m. The driveway stretched ahead of her, familiar and foreign at the same time. She pulled in slowly and sat in the car for 3 minutes before going inside. The kitchen table was exactly where she'd left it yesterday morning, Mia's breakfast dishes still waiting to be rinsed, 2 coffee mugs cold on the counter, a school permission slip Hannah had meant to sign but never had. She sat down and stared at nothing. The field journal sat on the top shelf of her closet upstairs, wrapped in a piece of dark fabric, pressed desert flowers dried inside its pages, the only physical proof that Commander Hannah Clarke had ever existed at all. Mommy. Hannah's eyes snapped up. Mia stood at the bottom of the stairs in her school uniform, backpack slung over one shoulder, her face shifting from sleepy to confused. 9 years old and already wearing the expression of a child who knew something was wrong but didn't have the words to ask. Why are you home? Are you sick? Mia's voice carried a note of worry. School started in 40 minutes. Mommy was always at work. Hannah tried to answer. Her throat closed. The composure that had carried her through 17 military missions, through hyperextension injuries and staph infections and a court-martial she still couldn't discuss, shattered across the kitchen table. Her eyes filled with tears, not the controlled single tear from room 318, but real tears, the kind that came from a place deeper than composure could reach. Mia dropped her backpack. She ran to her mother and pressed against her chest, confused and frightened. Mommy? Why are you crying? What happened? Hannah pulled her daughter close and couldn't answer. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that her mother's entire identity had just been erased? That the job Hannah had fought so hard to keep was gone in 90 seconds? That the military had ordered her to disappear years ago and now even her civilian life was vanishing? But that wasn't the worst part. At Valley Memorial, in the basement office where HR processed termination paperwork, Hannah's file had triggered something that no one in the conference room knew about. The routine background check required for all employee exits ran Hannah's social security number through a federal database, a completely standard procedure that activated security flags set up 3 years prior, flags that had been sitting in the system untouched, waiting. The computer terminal froze. A code appeared on the screen that made the HR coordinator lean back in her chair, her finger hovering over the phone. The system had flagged a security clearance level, active, verified, and clearance category that existed 3 levels above the hospital administrator's pay grade. Automatic alerts generated simultaneously. 3 federal agencies received encrypted notifications. The Department of Defense. Homeland Security. One agency whose acronym didn't appear anywhere in the notification system, just a classification code that meant only certain people received the message. By 9:30 a.m., phone calls were being placed. By 10:15 a.m., the hospital board's emergency meeting had been scheduled. By 11:47 a.m., the machinery that had erased Commander Hannah Clarke 3 years ago was being set in motion to bring her back. The emergency board meeting at Valley Memorial began at precisely 12:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, in a conference room on the 4th floor where the lighting was too bright and the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and institutional anxiety. 6 board members sat along a mahogany table. The chief of staff occupied the head chair, his face the color of old concrete. A woman in a dark suit sat beside him, Homeland Security, credentials folded closed on the table like a warning. Nobody spoke until she did. Commander Hannah Clarke, the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of redacted files and classified corridors. Your hospital employed her under a false professional identity. Her actual security clearance supersedes everyone in this room, including the chief of staff. Including me, frankly. She slid a photograph across the table. Hannah in Desert Camouflage, 2019, her eyes carrying a kind of knowing that doesn't come from textbooks. She's been here for 4 years. You didn't know. The chief of staff's jaw worked soundlessly. A board member, the hospital's legal counsel, was already pulling up her personnel file on his laptop, his fingers moving in the jerky rhythm of a man watching his liability insurance calculations multiply in real time. The conference room doors opened. Colonel Hendricks entered in a civilian button-down, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose chest still registered every breath. The Homeland Security agent stood slightly, a gesture between respect and protocol. Hendricks took the empty chair at the table's center and looked directly at the chief of staff. "I want to make something clear," Hendricks said. His voice was steady, the kind of calm that comes from having given hard orders in harder places. That woman, Commander Clarke, led Trauma Unit 7 in Tikrit. For 18 months, she ran an aid station under direct fire. 0 casualties that reached her table. None. Not one soldier died on her watch. The silence that followed was the kind you could build walls with. A board member's pen stopped mid-note. The legal counsel's fingers froze above his keyboard. 17 missions, Hendricks continued. Combat operations where her unit provided medical support. 17. 0 losses after reaching her table. That's not a statistic. That's a record that doesn't exist outside of classified files. The conference room doors opened again. A man in dress blues entered, Special Forces Chaplain Mitchell, his uniform a river of ribbons, his bearing the particular gravity of someone who had prayed over soldiers and held mothers' hands at Dover. He carried a leather-bound book, its spine cracked from use. Unit History, Chaplain Mitchell said, opening the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. His voice had the cadence of scripture. Trauma Unit 7, Tikrit, 2019 through 2020. 17 operations. Commander Hannah Clarke. 0 fatalities post-arrival. The record states, and I quote, "Under Clarke's command, no soldier who reached the aid station died of treatable wounds." Her triage decisions saved an estimated 43 lives that would have been lost under standard protocols. He closed the book. The sound it made was like a gavel. Another door. An admiral, the hospital's visiting consultant, there for a routine quarterly review, walked in with an expression suggesting he'd been briefed in the hallway. His uniform coat hung with medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, a grammar of honor that the room had no vocabulary to read. Commander Clarke's service record, Admiral Chen said, positioning himself beside Hendricks like a flanking maneuver. Bronze Star for leadership under fire. Silver Star for a medical evacuation in hostile territory, conducted while maintaining fire support. Second Silver Star. He paused, letting each medal have its own weight. For maintaining a field hospital under sustained mortar fire for 11 consecutive hours. 11 hours. While treating wounded, she returned fire. While bandaging, she directed supply chains. While medics worked around her, she coordinated with 3 different command structures. 11 hours. A board member whispered something. Another pulled out a phone. A 4th person entered, a woman in a civilian suit, her credentials identifying her as a CIA liaison, though the room had already intuited this from the particular way she carried authority, as if she'd stepped out of redacted paragraphs and into awkward fluorescent lighting. She approached the table the way someone approaches a grave. "Your employee's operational code name was Atlas," she said, and the words hung in the air like they'd been soaked in classified ink. For 3 years, she operated in theater under that designation. She provided medical support to coalition forces and, in 6 documented cases, to enemy combatants who were wounded. Those 6 cases generated intelligence that prevented for separate terrorist attacks on American personnel. For attacks. stopped because she treated enemy soldiers well enough that they gave information that saved our people. The phone that one board member was holding began to record, not consciously, but habit, the automatic reflex of someone whose instinct was to document everything. The recording caught the room's stunned silence, the quality of air that changes when perspective shifts. Within seconds, another phone was recording. Then another. The footage would leave the room in pockets and purses, would be texted and shared, would spread across hospital group chats and veteran networks like a truth looking for air to breathe. By 3:47 p.m., the video had reached Reddit's UD military. By 4:22 p.m., it was on Vet TV's social media. Task and Purpose picked it up at 4:51 p.m. Military Facebook groups began sharing it with captions, "This is Commander Hannah Clarke. Atlas is real. She saved my best friend. This is the nurse who treated my brother in Tikrit." Comments accumulated in their hundreds, then hundreds more, veterans finding each other in the thread, comparing notes, confirming stories. 200 veteran accounts shared versions of the same narrative: a quiet commander, impossible standards, 0 casualties on her watch, the kind of leader you'd follow into any fire because you knew she'd get you out alive. Dr. Daniel Sterling sat in his office at 5:13 p.m. and watched the video compile on the hospital's internal network. He watched himself, his voice sharp with condescension, his posture the calculated slouch of someone displaying status through disregard, publicly humiliate a woman who held security clearances that required Pentagon approval. He watched his mentorship mentor's name appear in his email inbox at 5:16 p.m., saw the subject line, "We need to talk about your conduct." Dr. Rashad Okonkwo had taught Sterling at a 4th-tier Caribbean medical school, had been the one professor to believe in him when his board scores hovered in the low percentile range, when his clinical competency reviews were borderline, when other faculty suggested he reconsider his career trajectory. Okonkwo had written recommendations. Okonkwo had provided mentorship via email through Sterling's residency. Okonkwo had, against better judgment, invested in Sterling's professional future. At 5:24 p.m., Okonkwo's public statement appeared on the medical school's website and spread across professional Twitter with the force of a professional detonation. "I taught Daniel Sterling medicine, but I failed to teach him humanity. I disown him as my former student. His conduct, documented in the attached video, disgraces our profession. His cruelty toward a decorated combat veteran reveals the absence of character that should have disqualified him from medicine long ago. The medical school will be reviewing our mentorship standards." The statement was retweeted 847 times in the first 12 minutes. Valley Memorial's medical board opened a formal investigation at 5:31 p.m. At 5:47 p.m., they called the hospital's legal counsel and requested Sterling's complete publication record. By 6:03 p.m., they had discovered that Sterling's 2018 research paper on postoperative infection rates contained fabricated data, patient numbers that didn't exist in the hospital's records, outcomes that diverged from actual medical charts by such precise margins that the fabrication was obviously intentional. By 6:19 p.m., they had compiled 43 patient complaints about Sterling's diagnostic errors and dismissive behavior, complaints he'd systematically buried through calculated relationships with influential board members and attending physicians who owed him favors. Sterling's phone rang at 6:34 p.m. His wife. Her voice carried the weight of a video she'd seen, forwarded by her sister with a question mark that contained multitudes. "Is this really you?" At 6:47 p.m., Sterling tried calling Dr. Pemberton, his primary ally on the medical board. The call went to voicemail. His assistant, when he called again, informed him that Dr. Pemberton was unavailable and would be for the foreseeable future. By 7:15 p.m., Sterling had received formal notification that his hospital privileges were suspended pending investigation. His medical license faced review. The professional allies who had returned his calls for 3 years stopped responding to incoming messages. The motivational posters on his office wall, photographs of mountain peaks with words like excellence and integrity printed beneath them, suddenly read like accusations. At 7:23 p.m., Hannah received a phone call from Admiral Chen. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She listened to the words, Director of Emergency Medicine, newly created position, your terms, your conditions, your future, and understood that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her life. "I can't go back to who I was," Hannah said quietly. Mia was coloring at the kitchen table, her tongue poked out in concentration, completely unaware that her mother's entire reality was being rewritten in real time. "We're not asking you to," Admiral Chen replied. "We're asking you to be who you are." Hannah looked at the field journal on the counter, its battered cover, its pages holding pressed desert flowers and the only piece of Tikrit she'd allowed herself to carry home. The pressed flowers had no dates, no locations, no names. Just the botanical evidence that life had continued to bloom in places where death was routine. She accepted the position at 7:31 p.m. By 8:47 p.m., the hospital's public affairs office had released a statement. Valley Memorial was honored to announce the appointment of Commander Hannah Clarke as Director of Emergency Medicine, effective immediately. Commander Clarke brings distinguished service and exceptional clinical leadership to our organization. The statement, attached to the viral video compilation of her humiliation and her firing, spread across veteran networks with the force of vindication. Comments accumulated in real time. Combat veterans who had served with her. Soldiers she had treated. Colleagues from classified operations. The count reached 200 by midnight. Then 300. Then 400. Each comment a small validation, a piece of her erased history being reconstructed in public forums and military subreddits, veterans bearing witness to what official records had tried to bury. Dr. Sterling's next employment came through a temp agency on a Wednesday morning. Happy Paws Animal Clinic needed front desk coverage. Sterling took the position because it was the only interview that didn't end with the hiring manager recognizing his name from the viral video and suddenly discovering the position was already filled. His name tag said Dan. Hannah's first day as Director of Emergency Medicine began with a standing ovation in the ER staff briefing room. She acknowledged it with a single nod, the kind of gesture that contained neither acceptance nor rejection, just recognition. The staff understood, this woman didn't need their applause. She had carried far heavier things than their admiration. In her new office, Hannah placed the field journal in the top desk drawer. Its pressed flowers, yellow ones from a particular desert bloom, crushed between pages dated and undated, represented the only piece of Tikrit she had allowed herself to carry home. The ghosts of soldiers she had saved, held in botanical form, inaccessible to anyone without clearance and willing to read between the invisible lines. She returned to work, and this time, nobody called her just a nurse. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the moment someone decides to tell your story. Like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Comment below, would you have saved him or walked away?